Springer has now been swimming alone in Washington's Puget Sound for at least 6 months. And the scientists here are keen to take her home to Canada. But why the rush? Puget Sound is already home to 84 killer whales. They eat the same food as Springer. Why not let them adopt this orphaned orca? The problem is that local killer whales will have nothing to do with Springer. And the reason? She has a foreign accent. No one understands killer whale communication better than John Ford. For 15 years, he's been studying their sophisticated, mysterious language. Ford is able to eavesdrop on the whales by dropping a special waterproof microphone into the ocean.
Goes down to perhaps 10 meters.
Perhaps make a little recording here.
Very distinctive dialect sounds of I-31 pod. And the animals are kind of scattered foraging. We're ahead of them, so we're detecting their high-pitched echolocation clicks. These sounds here, sort of popping sounds, they're clicks that they're using to navigate to find food.
Killer whales live in waters where visibility is often less than 7 meters. And so they use sound the way a bat does, as a kind of radar. They bounce their clicks off fish and rocks, listening to the echo to judge distance.
They also use a very complex set of very distinctive loud calls that are between 1 and 2 seconds long within the group and between groups to keep in touch. It seems each individual born to a group learns a repertoire of calls that is actually a sort of a vocal tradition in that lineage that allows it, it seems, to be part of that group.
This is where Springer learned her calls, from her own family called the A-pod. And she's still using their distinct dialect. It should help her family recognize Springer, if she can be returned north to these waters.
These dialects are very stable. Probably they outlive the actual individuals in the group, so I suspect that some of these major dialects have been around probably for decades, if not centuries, and are just simply passed on from generation to generation. Those kind of calls are very typical of their repertoire, their dialect.
Like humans, killer whales aren't born with their calls and have to learn them from their families. Killer whales can learn up to 12 distinct sounds unique to their pod. Springer had mastered them before she lost her mother and wandered into Puget Sound. But Springer's dialect is causing problems here in Washington. Local whales can tell she's a stranger just by the way she sounds. Her timing is terrible. This 2-year-old needs her family to teach her how to hunt for fish. Ironically, if she was much older, her dialect might attract a mate. Lance Barrett Leonard is a population geneticist at the Vancouver Aquarium. He has used John Ford's acoustic research to understand how dialects affect a killer whale's love life.
Neither males nor females leave their mothers, and so of course the obvious question is, are they inbred, and if not, how do they avoid inbreeding? This led me into a fairly extensive set of paternity tests.
DNA was collected from killer whales. The genes of the young were compared to genes of older males in the pods, and the results were striking. None of the older males were fathers of the calves. This proved that fathers are outsiders who don't live with the mothers or their children.
So although they spend their entire lives living in their natal pod, they don't breed within it. The fathers were always outside the pod. Resident killer whales are organized not only into pods but into clans, or acoustic clans, or language groups, dialect groups. And the fathers of calves are usually outside the dialect group or the clan.
Killer whales, it seems, use the equivalent of one-night stands to avoid incest, and fathers are always strangers, who sound very different from the pod. Females even choose elderly males so that their daughters can't mate with their fathers by mistake. For killer whales, this is the language of love. But for Springer, it may be years before her dialect attracts a mate. And right now, she needs human help simply to get home. In Seattle, Jeff Foster's team gets ready for a second rescue attempt. Once again, the team sets out to capture Springer, but this time, they'll use their hands. The ocean currents are too strong to use the net enclosure today.
There's always a potential danger jumping into the water with a large animal. These animals are very powerful. You don't know how they're going to respond when they're in that kind of situation.
If the plan works, it will be the first time a wild orca has ever been captured in order to be returned to the wild. Foster has been earning Springer's trust for weeks. Now it's time to put it to the test. The first step is to slip a noose around Springer's tail.
It was nerve-wracking. He had incredible patience and just waited for exactly the right time. I'm thinking, this isn't going to work today, this isn't going to work. And then all of a sudden, Jeff just slipped the noose over the tail, pulled on it, and it was amazing.
Once we had the tail line on her and we were able to cinch it up, then we knew that we had her under somewhat control. And then at that point, it's important to get in there and raise her head and get a hold of her pectoral fins and hang onto the dorsal, because they have a tendency to spin when they're in tail loop, and get her up and make sure she has good solid breaths.
All she did was do a few little sort of tentative duck dive things with her head and slap her tail around a couple times.
More bodies, more people in the water.
Once we had control of the head, we brought other divers into the water to be able to manipulate her back into the stretcher.
This is the dangerous part. A thrashing 500-kilogram killer whale can easily break a diver's bones. Foster's team has come to expect it, but Springer puts up very little resistance.
Bradley called landing craft in. Yeah, they're on their way.
Surrounded on all sides, she allows the team to slip her into a stretcher. It's the beginning of the strangest ride of her young life.
Just a little bit, just a placement. Let's clear the belly strap. Yeah.
She is hoisted onto a barge that will be her home for the next hour. The first stage of Springer's journey home to her family in Canada is complete. But no one knows if they will accept her, or if she will be healthy enough to make the trip. After spending months all alone, 2-year-old Springer is now surrounded by doting adults. The orphan killer whale doesn't appear upset, and her human friends are thrilled.
Yeah, she was going like this, and I just didn't want to bump her with it.
Springer is on her way home, but she won't be going to Canada right away. First, she needs to be admitted to a unique animal hospital. Her speckled skin and low weight prove that she's sick and in need of treatment quickly.
This we're going to use to test all of her general health parameters, try to understand, one, how she's doing, and if she has any major medical problems, what we can do about it.
Springer's care is now in the hands of veterinarians from the United States and Canada.
We wanted to give her a clean bill of health and a health certificate. It was very important to check her to make sure that she wasn't going to bring any diseases back from Puget Sound to the whales in northern Vancouver Island and put her pod or other pods up north at risk.
It's extremely important to get a blood sample. We had to find out if she had any inborn errors of metabolism. Was there something inherent in her that would not make her one that we would want to return to her pod?
For the rescue team, Springer is a rare opportunity. For most of them, they're used to studying killer whales hands-on in aquariums or washed up dead on a beach. This is a chance to both study and cure a living wild killer whale. And Springer's been living in a dangerous place. Industrial chemicals have been pouring into the ocean here for decades. The situation has become so drastic that wildlife toxicologist Peter Ross was asked to investigate, and his findings are shocking.
The Pacific killer whales frequenting the waters off Vancouver, Victoria, Seattle are now considered the most contaminated marine mammals anywhere in the world. And when I say contaminated, I'm talking about PCBs, polychlorinated biphenyls. We tend to be concerned about these chemicals because they're very toxic. They tend to be very persistent. They're fat soluble, they bioaccumulate in food chains. They just don't disappear.
PCBs were banned in Canada and the United States over 20 years ago. But just as Peter Ross found, they didn't go away. They drift through the air and in the oceans and are still manufactured in Russia. PCBs collect in ocean sediment and are then gobbled up by fish. The salmon stocks of the Pacific coast are one of the primary food sources for resident killer whales like Springer, and they too contain PCBs and many other contaminants.
The whales are getting a double whammy here. They're at the top of the food chain, eating concentrated amounts of toxic prey, and they live a long time, and they're unable to offload it.
Males seem to have it worst. They spend their entire lives collecting and storing PCBs in their fat tissues. Females, however, can actually lose PCBs. The chemicals leave their bodies through the fat in breast milk and are passed on to their young. Springer was probably born with PCBs, and the fish she has been eating contain them too. Her low weight suggests that her body has survived by consuming body fat, a perfect way to release PCBs into the bloodstream.
We know that PCBs cause cancer. We know that PCBs affect the immune system. This means they're more vulnerable to disease. They may be more vulnerable to getting a cold or a little infection, or that cold might develop into a much more serious infection that they can't recover from.
No one knows why Springer's mother died, but she was part of a generation that came of age when PCBs were still being produced legally, and her death may have been caused by side effects of the chemical. PCBs are now one of the prime suspects in the deaths of American killer whales. With no natural enemies, most killer whales should die of old age, but the southern resident population here is down to just 84 members, and it seems to be both the young and the PCB generation that are dying the most. Springer's doctors aren't exactly sure why she's sick. It could be PCBs, even a genetic anomaly. They decide to run a series of tests, hoping that they can cure her and then send her home. For now, this holding pen is both home and hospital, although no one here is sure that she'll be a willing patient and remain inside.
Two riskiest aspects of the whole capture were when you first go in the water with her and try to control her head during the capture itself, and then also when we put her into an environment with walls, the net pen. We don't know how she's going to respond. If she wanted to and swam hard enough and fast enough, she could go punch right through the net. And she's from a three-dimensional world where she doesn't have really any barriers, and they don't know what to do when they come to a corner. A lot of times they can get their nose down into a net, or if the net isn't hung properly, they can get entangled in it very easily.
Springer has a good chance of recovering and ultimately returning to Canada to connect with her pod. But first, Springer's rescuers will have to practice a little whale medicine on a very sick child of the sea.